we like to talk about how the Gregorian University was founded by St. Ignatius himself at the very origin of the Jesuits in 1551, and it's been entrusted to the Jesuits ever since. That's not quite true. There's this gap of about 40 years where the Gregorian was not run by the Jesuits because the Jesuits did not exist. They were suppressed by Rome. I mean, it's a long and complicated story, but in the middle of the 18th century, the Jesuits were one of the most powerful forces in Europe. I mean, we had 800 schools, mainly in Europe, but around the world. We were in Japan, we were in China, in what's now Indonesia, of course in South America, in Africa, all over the world, and had a lot of influence, even politically. And of course, what really annoyed some of the kings, especially from Spain and Portugal, was that Jesuits in South America were protecting the Indians and their property from the conquistadores. And, you know, getting between an adventurer and his money is a very dangerous exercise. So the Bourbon Kings, especially in Spain, Portugal, France, and some of the kingdoms like Naples in Italy, just decided they had to get the Jesuits out of the way. So they kept kicking them out of their various countries and finally prevailed on the Pope, who didn't want to do it, but was subject to their power himself, to issue a decree putting the Jesuits out of existence. And except for a little corner in Russia where Catherine the Great refused to go along, he did. So what did the Jesuits do? I mean, there were thousands of them. Well, some became secular priests, some went back to normal life, not left religious life, but many remained faithful to their life together. They stayed in a community. They weren't allowed in ministry, but they stayed together. They prayed together. They lived their common life, and even that was opposed by the kings, and so they were sent from one country and another in exile. And there were times when this group, led by St. Joseph Pignatelli, was on a ship out in the Mediterranean and had no place to go. They were like today's migrants. There was no place to land, so they just made do on the ship, and then they were able to sneak in one place or another. So they were on the run for 40 years. Imagine what that was like. Your whole life, everything you had believed in and what you were convinced was God's call to you has been destroyed. And yet you still believe, and that was the amazing thing. They did not give up on their calling, and somehow they trusted that God would make something good come of that. So that's what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel, that we have to be persistent in prayer. We have to trust God, even if we don't see the results right away. Now, why isn't it? Why doesn't God just give us what we want and show how good God is? And you hear that complaint all the time. You know, a mother with a dying child, how could God help make this happen? Or when your children have been shot in their school, how could a good God do this? Or look at the carnage in Ukraine. So it raises issues about God. But most of all, it raises issues about trust. Do I really trust in God? And am I willing to stake my life on it, as these Jesuits were? Well, the reason that this is so difficult for us, but so important, is our understanding of prayer. And this is what Jesus is trying to teach us. Prayer is not a transaction. You know, it's not a quid pro quo. I give you my 10 Hail Marys and I get my raise at work. Or, you know, I promise to stop smoking if my child will get well. We often deal with God that way. It's a very human thing to do. It's okay. But it's not adequate. Because prayer is not a transaction. It's a relationship. And building a relationship takes time. You know, people don't get married after the first date. Today they don't get married till after the 500th date. But anyway, but what these young people realize, a relationship takes time to build because it requires trust. And trust requires experience and knowledge and the constant deepening of your own willingness to open your heart to the other, but also to receive their commitment, their love. And that can only be done over time, and it only works when we trust and are willing to stay with the process. And that's what God asks of us. And if we do trust in the process, then we draw closer and closer to God. And as we draw closer to God, our will comes into convergence with God's will. And that's good because God always wants to give us what's best for us, which may not be what we wanted at the beginning, or it may be. But it brings us closer to God's will and therefore closer to our good if we're willing to trust in God's goodness. There are a couple of other things that relate to that these readings talk about. Prayer is not just words. We saw that in the first reading. I mean, Moses had to pray with his whole body. If he put his arms down and didn't get his body involved, the prayer had no effect. So God wants our total investment, our personal investment in our prayer. And if we do that, then the power relationship flips, as it did for the widow. The widow was powerless, but because she gave her whole self, she forced the judge to see her as a human being and worthy of the judge's attention. And therefore, she became equal to him in power. So prayer requires mutuality. It's not just the all-powerful, all-knowing God looking down on us, but God wants us to be on the level of friendship. And the third thing is, Moses just found it too hard to give himself totally to this, so his friends help us. And we always pray in community. That's why we have a church, because we support one another when our arms get heavy. And that's the gift that God gives us as well. So how do we think of prayer? Well, in terms of the Gregorian, you'll see this tomorrow, prayer is not the vending machine, you know, where you throw in your €2 and get a Coke out. And it's also not the lecture hall, where you have the powerful, all-knowing sage at the front dispensing knowledge. I mean, God is the all-powerful, all-knowing one, but God doesn't want that kind of relationship. No. The closest analogy, and it's an analogy, it's not perfect, is the coffee bar. Why? Well, when you hear students talk about that experience, the coffee bar is where they all go after class with their professors often, and they debate what they heard. So they might come out of a moral theology class and debate about international relations, or come out of a marriage class and talk about the meaning of marriage, or an ecclesiology class and talk about what should a bishop be. But you have people from every continent, every place in the world, bringing their specific experiences and culture and history and their values and commitments, and bouncing them off one another. And they trust one another enough that they can argue and learn from one another. You know, it's not like we are, well, I'm never going to bring up politics in this group kind of thing. And because there is that sense of unity and trust. And so they all grow and learn that. And that's the kind of relationship God wants with us, where we're willing to share, to give ourselves, and to receive the wonders that God gives us.